Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest EVN Masterclass. My name is Mary, and I'm one of the Policy Fellows at BASIC. So these EVN Masterclasses are a great opportunity to tap into the fantastic network of experts that BASIC is lucky to have, to share their expertise with you, our Emerging Voices network. As you know, the Masterclasses are aimed to be an accessible digital resource, primarily for our EVN members, but also for the general public. As previously mentioned, we have a landing page on our BASIC website where you will find a list of our previous masterclasses, and this session will also be uploaded there shortly as well. So today we are very pleased to be joined by Laura Rockwood. So Laura is a non-resident fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and she has over 35 years of experience in non-proliferation and international safeguards. She retired from the International Atomic Energy Agency in 2013 as section head for the Non-Proliferation and Policy Making in the Office of Legal Affairs after 28 years of service. During her time with the IAEA, she was a senior legal advisor on all aspects of the negotiation, interpretation, and implementation of IAEA safeguards, and was the principal author of the document that became the Model Additional Protocol. She participated in high-level negotiations on Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and in the IAEA US-Russian Federation negotiations on the Trilateral Initiative and the Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement. Prior to her current position with VCD-NP, Laura served as Executive Director of the Open Nuclear Network, a programme of One Earth Future, and as Executive Director of the VCD-NP between 2015 and 2019. So today, Laura will be talking about nuclear safeguards and safeguarding. The session will offer a brief introduction to international nuclear safeguards, focusing on the IAEA, the NPT, legal instruments, and the implementation of safeguards. So after Laura's presentation, we'll have some time for discussion, so you can share any thoughts, comments, or questions for Laura you may have. And with that, Laura, I'll pass it over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I hope everybody can hear me and see me well. One never knows on these meetings. It's a pleasure to be joining you here. I would like to introduce to you my take on the nuclear non-proliferation regime and its evolution over the years. I have a theory about the nuclear non-proliferation regime and IAEA safeguards. And it is that it came about as a function of states' need for individual and collective security. And it has evolved as a function of shifting perceptions about where the threat to that security has come from. So what I've done is I've created a presentation that takes successively shorter periods of time and shows not only that safeguards have changed over the years, but that the rate of change within the non-proliferation regime seems to be ever increasing. So I'm going to try to share my screen and we'll get started on our journey through time into the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Now, next thing I have to do is try to start from the beginning. Hopefully that'll do it. Yeah, great. So the dawn of the nuclear non-proliferation regime began with the discovery of the fissionability of Lise Meitner, an Austrian scientist, and Otto Hahn, a German scientist, in 1938. It was heralded by the flash of most terrible brilliance over the desert of New Mexico in July 1945 with something called the Trinity test. The threat that we're talking about: in August 1945, the United States destroyed the city of Hiroshima using a nuclear weapon referred to as the Little Boy. And you will see why in a moment, but regardless of this clever little name, it was a nuclear weapon built from high enriched uranium. That's uranium in excess of 20% enriched, probably closer to 90–95%. Very simple gun type, very effective, relatively easy construct. Destroyed the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the United States destroyed the city of Nagasaki using a somewhat more complicated, complex weapon, a plutonium implosive device, which requires that explosives explode simultaneously around the core of the fissile material, which in this case was plutonium. Again, very clever euphemism for this, fat man and little boy, but they were horrific weapons, and they are what we are trying to prevent happening again. So let's open this journey in the first 25 years of IAEA safeguards. You see the formation of the United Nations, the Atoms for Peace proposal, the creation of the IAEA and Euratom almost simultaneously, and the development of the agency's first safeguard system. So let's dive into this. Very shortly after the UN was created in January of 1946, the very first initiative that was taken by the UN General Assembly was to create a commission to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energies, the so-called Atomic Energy Commission. The terms of reference for this commission were to make specific proposals for extending between all nations basic scientific information, develop proposals for the control of atomic energy to make sure it's used only for peaceful purposes, the elimination of national armaments for atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction, WMD, and for the first time ever, calling for proposals for effective safeguards by way of inspection and other means to protect complying states against the hazards of violations and evasions. Now, I don't know why this is, there we go. So what we're talking about is the perceived risk. Now, in the early days, between the time the US destroyed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the very sort of mid-1950s, there was a sense that there were peaceful applications for nuclear energy, and that the first effort would be the technology holders would deny it to other states in order to control its spread. Now, that denial didn't work because a lot of other countries had capable scientists, resources of uranium, etc. So the question was, if we're going to supply nuclear materials and equipment, maybe we need to be worried about a recipient state misusing the supply of the material and items. And initially, states said, don't worry about my trading partners, I'll take care of them, and I will conclude a bilateral safeguards agreement with them to make sure they promise not to misuse supplied material and items. Well, that was okay for the US and its contracting partners, but that didn't necessarily sit very well with the Soviet Union and its trading partners. So very early on, there was a decision that instead of simply unilateral restraint, there needed to be an independent international verification body rather than bilateral verification. And that body should be tasked with developing a system so that it could verify that no supplied material and items are misused. Well, that resulted in a proposal by President Dwight Eisenhower at the 1953 UN General Assembly, when his very famous Atoms for Peace speech, he proposed the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It was originally conceived of as a broker of all things nuclear. As you may well know, that isn't exactly how things have developed, but the idea was you'd have an independent international body, not subordinate to the United Nations, that would be responsible for promoting the safe and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. 4 years later, the IAEA came into being in 1957 as an independent, autonomous, intergovernmental organization. That is to say, it is not a specialized agency of the UN, but it does have a very special relationship with the Security Council. It has direct access and direct responsibilities to the Security Council, the entity that has the principal responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The IAEA currently has 178 member states, and it is the statute that created it that authorizes the agency to implement safeguards. Now, a couple of things you may not know about safeguards. In this little orange book, which happens to be the agency's statute, there are 3 provisions with which you should become familiar. The first is Article 3A5, and this is the fundamental authority for agency safeguards. It says the agency has the authority to implement safeguards in 3 distinctly different circumstances. The first case, if the agency provides technical assistance in the form of nuclear material or a nuclear facility, that is the single case in which the agency can say, you must accept safeguards. So agency assistance comes with the requirement that the state receiving that assistance accepts safeguards on the supplied items, facility, or materials. The second case in which the agency is authorized to implement safeguards is in response to any bilateral or multilateral arrangement that calls for the implementation of safeguards. Now, this was back in the early 1950s, and the NPT didn't come into being until the 1970s. So it was pretty prescient of the states that negotiated the statute to anticipate that there might be bilateral or multilateral arrangements calling for agency safeguards. The third instance in which the agency may implement safeguards is at the response of any state to its nuclear activities. Now, why would a state do that? Generally, it was because it was a condition of supply, and it would apply only to the items designated in the safeguards agreement. There's a second provision, a very important provision in the statute, which describes what the negotiators of the statute thought safeguards might look like. Certainly on-site inspection, in-field inspection, anytime, anyplace access, reporting and record keeping by the state, and what to do in the case of non-compliance. Now, you notice that I've highlighted anytime, anyplace access, and I do that because I wanted to underscore, as much as the drafters thought that would be necessary, that isn't the way safeguards actually have developed to work. But what it does do is it shows you how concerned the drafters were about the threat posed by nuclear weapons. Can you imagine a treaty at this day and age calling for anytime, anyplace access? I can't. But again, it isn't how safeguards developed. It just is a placeholder to tell you the fear that states held in the mid-1950s about the further spread of nuclear weapons. Now, the third article I'd like to draw to your attention is the definition of nuclear material. And there are 2 kinds of nuclear material. Special fissionable material, the stuff that makes the nuclear weapon explode, plutonium, enriched uranium, and U-233. There is source material on the basis of which you can produce special fissionable material, and that includes natural uranium, depleted uranium, which is a byproduct of enrichment, and thorium. Now, a couple of fine points about IAEA safeguards. Just because your countries may be members of the IAEA doesn't mean that you're required to accept safeguards. It is not membership in the IAEA that compels you to accept safeguards. Plus, safeguards can be applied even in non-member states or in non-states. North Korea used to be a member of the agency and then withdrew in the early 1990s. And Taiwan, China, which isn't even recognized as a state by most countries, the IAEA implements safeguards as if it were a state with the concurrence of the People's Republic of China. Now, the important thing to remember, though, that safeguards requires the consent of the state. This can be done on a voluntary basis, which is rather what South Africa did after it concluded its safeguards agreement with the agency. and then invited the agency to any place, anytime, any place access to confirm to the global community that it had in fact dismantled its nuclear weapons program. That's not normally what happens. The second case is if the Security Council adopts a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, any member state that is a member of the United Nations is required to take that action. That is exactly what happened in the case of Iraq in 1991 in response to Resolution 687. But mostly what the agency does is it implements safeguards agreements, and there are three kinds. The first kind were the very, very early item-specific safeguards agreements, and we call them item-specific because they're very limited in terms of their application. They only apply to the material, the equipment, or the facilities that are specifically identified in the safeguards agreement. Now, those early agreements are based on an internal agency document called INFCIRC, meaning Information Circular, INFCIRC 66. INFCIRC 66 was a set of procedures that were developed in the early to mid 1960s to be implemented in the case of item-specific safeguards agreements. The only ones that continue to be implemented nowadays are in India, Israel, and Pakistan. The voluntary offer agreements have been concluded with the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States. They are called voluntary offer agreements because under the NPT, these states are not obliged to conclude safeguards agreements with the agency. So most of the safeguards that the IAEA implements are what we call comprehensive safeguards or full scope safeguards. And we frequently call them CSAs. They are based on another information circular, INFCIRC 153, and we currently implement them in 182 of all but 4 of the non-nuclear weapon states that are parties to the NPT, of which about 3/4 have also concluded additional protocols, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. While the North Koreans did conclude a CSA back in the early 90s, the agency hasn't been permitted to implement any kind of verification activities there since 2009. So item-specific agreements, VOAs, and CSAs. So when I first joined the agency many, many years ago, I hadn't the slightest clue how safeguards work. And what I was told is, in order to get to nuclear weapons, you needed certain kinds of material. And that material was high enriched uranium, which thankfully doesn't grow on trees. You have to mine the ore, concentrate it, convert it, and then enrich it up to a level of around 90% U-235. Now, the other material, so the HEU is what was used on Hiroshima, plutonium, which was used on Nagasaki, likewise doesn't grow on trees. One has to take the same initial actions by converting uranium and either enriching it or converting it directly into fuel, putting it in a reactor, irradiating it, and either, well, storing it and then later reprocessing it, or going direct to reprocessing and extracting the plutonium. So one of the thoughts I had early on was, why don't we just ban the production of HEU and PU? The problem is that you can use both of those materials for commercial reactors. So it wasn't convenient to ban the production of HEU or PU. Now, the other sort of quirky thing is nuclear-related research and development. There is a lot of nuclear-related infrastructure to the nuclear fuel cycle that doesn't involve nuclear material. Research centers, laboratories, universities, that sort of thing. But as I said, back in the day, the idea was there were 2 types of material and you needed a lot of it in order to have a nuclear weapon. We'll see in a few slides how some of those early assumptions were mistaken. Now, under the very early, very first safeguards agreements, the item-specific ones, you can see there are lots of gaps in the nuclear fuel cycle. These indeed were not non-proliferation safeguards. These were not situations where the states promised not to have nuclear weapons. They simply promised not to misuse the items that were under safeguards. So lots of gaps. Near the end of this first 25-year period, though, you have a crisis that damn near triggered the blowing up of the entire Northern Hemisphere. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis between the US and Soviet Union, where the two countries are on the verge of coming to nuclear blows. But the upside of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the states in the region got together and said, not in my backyard. So the countries of Latin America and later the Caribbean started negotiating what came to be known as the Tlatelolco Treaty, the very first nuclear weapon-free zone treaty for an inhabited territory. It required all states not to acquire nuclear weapons and to use nuclear material only for peaceful uses, and to accept safeguards on all of its nuclear activities. There are a lot more details in that, but for the purposes of safeguards, we'll leave that for Q's and A's. So simultaneously with the negotiation of the Tlatelolco Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty negotiations were also underway. The negotiations on that treaty were finalized in 1968. It was opened for signature and entered into force 2 years later. So the first 25 years was about creating an international body that was capable of verifying non-misuse of nuclear material. The next 2 decades were about how do we develop and implement a comprehensive safeguard system that applies to all nuclear material. So it starts with the entry into force of the NPT, the approval of the very first NPT safeguards agreements. In the meanwhile, India tests a so-called peaceful nuclear device. You see the development under the bottom lines of export controls, nuclear suppliers group. You then see a number of events happening. The Israel bombs the Iraqi reactor Tuwaitha. North Korea becomes party to the NPT. You have the expansion of nuclear weapon-free zones into the South Pacific. And over this 20-year period, a lot of experience with safeguards. But what challenges were we trying to address in the 70s and 80s? The possible misuse of indigenous nuclear fuel cycles. That is to say, you have states who have their own scientists, their own equipment, their own nuclear material, and they start developing their own domestic nuclear fuel cycles, many of which in the early days dabbled in nuclear weapons. So how does the international organization verify that nuclear fuel cycles aren't being diverted for non-peaceful purposes? We didn't have a safeguard system for verifying supplied and produced nuclear material, so we had to create one. And the export controllers got together and decided maybe we should all be a little bit more careful and share the lists of things that can only be used for nuclear fuel cycles, what they call single-use equipment and material. Now, I'm not going to touch on export controls because we don't have a lot of time, but simultaneously with the development of safeguards, you have the parallel development of export controls over the next 20 years. It starts with the NPT. Under Article 1, the nuclear weapon states promised not to provide nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices to non-nuclear weapon states. For their part, the non-nuclear weapon states agree not to acquire nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices and to accept safeguards on all nuclear material. Please note that under the NPT, there is no absolute prohibition of military nuclear uses. It is about explosive uses. And if you've been reading the news lately, you will know that one of the key military uses that isn't illegal under the NPT is nuclear naval propulsion. Okay, we can chat about that later. And all states parties to the NPT agree to impose safeguards as a condition of supply of nuclear material and single-use items if it's going to a non-nuclear weapon state, to facilitate the exchange of technology. And interestingly enough, all states parties are similarly bound to pursue negotiations on nuclear disarmament. So as I said, back in the day in the 1970s, we didn't have a system for comprehensive safeguards agreements. It had to be created. So in a committee of the Board of Governors, open-ended, indeed, many of the states that participated in this committee, Committee 22, weren't even yet parties to the NPT. But they came up with a document, INFCIRC 153, which was an instruction to the Secretariat about what these new agreements should look like and the content of those new agreements. So under INFCIRC 153 and all comprehensive safeguards agreement, the state agrees to accept safeguards on all source or special fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities within the territory of the state, under its jurisdiction, or carried out under its control anywhere. Now, I want you to look carefully at the words all peaceful nuclear activities. That doesn't mean that a state can put material into a military activity and say to the agency, that's off limits. The assumption is that a state party to a CSA will declare all nuclear material, and if it wants to use nuclear material for a non-prohibited military activity, like submarines, then it must conclude an arrangement with the IAEA to make sure that material doesn't go missing during that activity, which you may have heard referred to as paragraph 14 or article 14, but fundamentally to accept safeguards on all source and special fissionable material. The state's basic obligations include creating a system that can account for and control nuclear material, because that information needs to be provided to the agency, and the state needs to be able to make sure that the agency has the access that the safeguards agreement contemplates. But both the state and the agency are obliged to cooperate with one another in the implementation of safeguards. For its part, the agency's role is twofold. Principally, the timely, I underscore timely, detection of the diversion of significant quantities of nuclear material. Why significant quantities? Remember, back in the day, it was thought that it took a lot of nuclear material to create a nuclear weapon. So, detection of diversion of significant quantities of nuclear material to the manufacture of nuclear weapons, other nuclear explosive devices, or purposes unknown. The IAEA doesn't have to prove that a state has actually a nuclear weapons program. All it needs to do is see indications that nuclear material has disappeared and we don't know what's been done with it, or that there's more than you anticipate. So detection of diversion and deterrence of that diversion by the risk of early detection. So the idea is the better safeguards are, the stronger they are, the less likely a state will try to cheat on the safeguards agreement, because it's more likely to be caught out in its cheating, okay? Detection of diversion and deterrence of diversion by the risk of early detection. Now, I want to point out that diversion can refer to two possible things: the actual use of declared nuclear material for prohibited purposes, but also taking undeclared nuclear material, that's material that hasn't been declared to the agency illegally, and using that for prohibited purposes, both of which are illegal under the state CSA. There are many, many comprehensive safeguards agreements concluded by the IAEA, certainly most of which are with those non-nuclear weapon states pursuant to the NPT. But as you see, there are at least 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zone treaties that also require states to conclude CSAs: Latin America and the Caribbean, South Pacific, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central Asia. We also concluded safeguards agreements based on 153 with Argentina and Brazil. They subsequently became parties to the NPT, but their safeguards agreement in substance is practically identical to 153. Interestingly enough, 153 served as the basis for the voluntary offer agreements with the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states. But the scope is very different, and the implementation of safeguards is discretionary under those agreements, as opposed to obligatory under a comprehensive safeguards agreement. So when we looked at the routine safeguards coverage under comprehensive safeguards agreements at the end of this first 20 years, we thought we were doing pretty well. We'd pretty much covered the key choke points of HEU and PU, and weren't terribly worried about small quantities of nuclear material or the production of heavy water or nuclear-related R&D. So even though we were fairly confident we were doing a good job, we were already beginning to come to terms with the fact that there were limitations in traditional safeguards in terms of where the agency could go and how frequently under routine access. We weren't worried too much about small quantities of nuclear material because you couldn't make a nuclear weapon with small quantities. We were very much focused on the material that was declared by the states. That is to say, if a state said it had 5 kilos of plutonium, we would confirm that it had 5 kilos of plutonium, but we weren't scouring the state to see whether the state had undeclared nuclear material and facilities. It wasn't because it legally wasn't possible, but because there was this balancing act that was going on. The agency was trying to do safeguards as well as it could, and the states were still a little bit nervous about a safeguards inspector. Indeed, more nervous about an inspector gone crazy than they thought a state might bother to conclude a treaty and then try to cheat on it. So we were very much focused on correctness, not so much on completeness. But the war in Iraq changed everything. The next 10 years, not 25, not 20, the next 10 years involved the discovery of Iraq's nuclear weapons program, South Africa finally becoming party to the NPT, then declaring it had 6 nuclear weapons and dismantled them, North Korea concluding a safeguards agreement, and then our detection of inconsistencies that indicated they were not declaring nuclear material that they had, plutonium specifically. You have the extension of the NPT and our first focus on strengthening safeguards that resulted in the model additional protocol. Lots of other key events during this very short period of time as well. This, by the way, when we want to talk about the threats, this is a diagram of a site not too far from Baghdad in Iraq. And the agency inspectors used to go there twice a year, announced inspections, to 3 facilities and a location outside of a facility. After the ceasefire resolution 687, in which the Security Council asked the Director General to map out and dismantle Iraq's nuclear weapons program, this is what we found. And only on the Tuwaitha site, there was much more activity outside of Tuwaitha taking place throughout Iraq. Just about everything you might need on an R&D scale for a nuclear weapons program. How did it get the material? it sent its scientists abroad to purchase dual-use equipment, brought it back, and made its own single-use equipment. How large were the quantities of nuclear material that we detected as being misused? At the time, very small quantities. So some of our fundamental assumptions about how safeguards should work really came into question, and not just by the Secretariat, but by the member states of the IAEA. Fundamentally, what the member states were worried about is the possibility of undeclared nuclear material and activities in the state. So they demanded that the agency pull up its socks and make sure that it is able to verify that all nuclear material and activities are declared and that there's no undeclared nuclear material and activities in the state. Separately, the export control community likewise strengthened its effort and developed lists that covered dual-use items. So this shifting perception, as states said, Secretariat, what are you doing about completeness? Does the agency even have the right to look for undeclared nuclear material? And indeed, it does. Under IMCIRC 153, paragraph 2, one of the first provisions under 153, it says that the agency not only has the right, but the obligation to ensure that safeguards will be applied on all source or special fissionable material. Not all declared, but all source or special fissionable material. So we started looking at how to provide assurances, not just of the correctness of states' declarations, but the completeness of those declarations. The next 6 or 7 years were also really challenging. We had the discovery and destruction of Iraq's nuclear weapons program. We had a very positive event in the Argentina-Brazil Quadripartite Safeguards Agreement, where, although they were not yet parties to the NPT, they decided to conclude a bilateral arrangement and forswear nuclear weapons. This is a traditional picture always used to demonstrate the South African 6 nuclear weapons. I have been told, let's say 6.5, I've been told that this actually isn't a picture of South African nuclear weapons, but it's frequently used to demonstrate it. Now, as I said, South Africa became party to the NPT, concluded its CSA, and then informed the global community that it had indeed had nuclear weapons and had dismantled them. Another positive, and then shortly thereafter negative, was the conclusion by North Korea of its safeguards agreement, but in very short order, our discovery of North Korea's attempts to cheat on its comprehensive safeguards agreement by failing to declare X number of quantities of nuclear material, specifically plutonium. So in the very early days, 91, 92, 93, both the Board of Governors of the IAEA and the General Conference on multiple occasions demanded that the Secretariat verify not just the correctness of states' declarations under comprehensive safeguards agreements, but also the completeness. Now, I mentioned this, and I want you to look at those dates. This is long before we even started thinking about an additional protocol. In the case of South Africa, both the board and the GC spoke. In the case of the board in 1992 on special inspections, confirming the agency's right to ensure that all nuclear materials are under safeguards. And in the case of 1993, North Korea, the board decided it was essential for the Secretariat to be able to verify the correctness and assess the completeness of North Korea's initial report. So remember, this is all without additional protocols, right? But between 1993 and 1997, we created a program called Program 93+2, which was designed to identify measures that we could use that would improve the agency's ability to achieve that objective of verifying correctness and completeness. And ultimately, it resulted in the negotiation by another committee of the Board of Governors, Committee 24, of what came to be known as the Model Additional Protocol. Why an additional protocol? Well, to standardize the measures, but also to give the tools, give the agency additional tools with which to do its job better. It is a protocol. This is a model protocol. And as the state concludes it, it is additional to a state's safeguards agreement. It's not a standalone agreement. What's new? Now the agency has information on all parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, not just nuclear material and facilities. It also has much broader access under a new kind of access. We invented a new name called complementary access to complement the design information verification and the inspection capability the agency already had under 153. Now, it also involved very much broader access, short notice, but generally not no notice inspection. And it also called for managed access to protect sensitive information. The agency also, the negotiators also include a number of simplified administrative measures to just make it easier, making the inspector designation process easier and reducing visa requirements. But what is not new under the Model Additional Protocol is the agency's right to carry out unannounced inspections, which it can already do under a CSA. The agency's right to request access to undeclared locations, also already available under the CSA, just not used very frequently. And finally, and I really want you to come away from this lecture, if you forget anything else, understand that the agency's right to verify correctness and completeness derives from the safeguards agreement itself. The additional protocol simply gives the agency more tools to do that job better. So, as you can see, with a CSA and additional protocol, we managed to plug most of the holes in the non-proliferation, the safeguards non-proliferation regime. Now, what happens in CSA states, if it has a CSA and an additional protocol, and the agency finds no indications that declared nuclear material has been diverted, and no indications of undeclared nuclear material or activities, it can draw the broader conclusion, which is now, it now reads all nuclear material remained in peaceful activities. And if it can assure itself, in particular, that there are no undeclared enrichment and reprocessing activities in the state, it may be able to implement a more tailored safeguards approach for the state. We call those state-level approaches, looking at the state as a whole, otherwise known as the state-level concept. We're not out of the woods yet. What Chernobyl was to nuclear safety and Iraq was to nuclear safeguards, 9/11 was to nuclear security. Nuclear security had traditionally been about international transfer by states of nuclear material. So they weren't addressing domestic transfers. They weren't addressing other radioactive substances besides nuclear material, and they weren't covering facilities. Well, imagine if those planes were flown by non-state actors. They were flown into facilities. What if those had been a reactor, a reprocessing plant, a spent fuel pond? And they were flying domestically. So as I said, this was an awakening moment for the nuclear security experts among our member states. Part one of the new millennium began with 9/11. And as you can see in fairly short order in that first decade, you have the Iraq resuming. We were able to resume inspections in Iraq, but unfortunately 4 months later had to withdraw them. You see multiple efforts to try to negotiate an agreement with North Korea that eventually falls apart by 2009. You see Libya's very nascent nuclear weapons program that was discovered in 2003. You see the Security Council getting in the act on non-state actors and nuclear security. DPRK closes out this decade by expelling the IAEA and testing its first nuclear weapons. So what were the challenges of this first 10 years of the 2000s? Non-state actors and radiological dispersal devices. So the idea was, let's improve the physical security, not just of nuclear material, but facilities as well, and other radioactive materials, materials that are radioactive but aren't defined as nuclear material. And separately, let's make sure we have effective domestic and transborder controls. So a quick slide on the difference between safeguards and security. Nuclear safeguards are about detection and deterrence of diversion of nuclear material by a state. Historically, nuclear security has been about detection and the deterrence of the misuse of nuclear and other radioactive materials by non-state actors. Now, maybe that latter part is a little bit under question, because clearly what Russia is doing in Zaporizhia in Ukraine is a challenge to nuclear security. But fundamentally, safeguards are about detection, deterrence of diversion of nuclear material by a state. Security focuses on nuclear and other radioactive substances and facilities by non-state actors. As I said, in 2004, the Security Council also got into the act on the subject of WND and the role of non-state actors. Also a Chapter 7 resolution requiring effective border controls, accounting and security, physical protection, and fundamentally effective national legislation. So these 7 or 8 years were just as difficult as the first opening years of the 1990s. We have the agency going back into Iraq and 4 months later having to pull our inspectors out. As you see here, you have Mohammed al-Baradei, who was the head of the IAEA at that time. And sitting next to him is Hans Blix, the former head of the IAEA, who had been post-retirement tasked by the UN Security Council with addressing Iraq's chemical, missile, and biological weapons programs. Very sadly, 4 months later, we had to withdraw our inspectors. During the same period, you have the discovery of Iran's nuclear program and multiple discoveries about its previous breaches, its failure to declare nuclear material facilities and activities. You see the upside after Libya was detected as having had a very, let's say, infant nuclear weapons program. It was caught out early on. It gave up all the material, equipment, and documentation, and concluded an additional protocol. There you see the governor from Libya signing an additional protocol with Mohammed al-Baradei. You see the rise of this gentleman's notoriety. This is A.Q. Khan, a Pakistani who stole centrifuge enrichment designs from Urenco while he was working for a subcontractor for Urenco, and decided he would market this around the world. I can assure you, he was not teaching his students how to play soccer, but rather describing the advanced implosion type device to not just his students in Pakistan, but around the world: North Korea, Iran, Libya, and so on. What happened also during this period? Israel bombs what has come to be known as a reactor in the middle of the desert in Syria. Also, you have, as I mentioned, we were back into North Korea, out, in, out, and then finally in 2009, we were kicked out pretty much for good. We haven't been back since then from North Korea. That's just the first half of the 2000s. The second half begins with the election of President Obama, the creation of the Nuclear Security Summit process, followed by the Fukushima Daiichi accident, Syria being reported to the Council, North Korea's third, fourth, fifth, and sixth nuclear weapons tests, the very, very positive conclusion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, and the sad withdrawal by the United States a few short years later. You also see the development of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. So let's, again, dive a little bit more deeply into what was in the news in this new millennium, the 2010s. Pretty significant. We started seeing a lot of challenges to the IAEA's authority, challenges that had been put to rest in the early 1990s. There were challenges to the NPT regime itself, with the discovery of Iran's undeclared nuclear program and the developments in North Korea. And if you will recall, President Trump's initial response to North Korea was fire and fury. So there were actual concerns that the US and the DPRK might evolve into a nuclear exchange. During this same period, we had been discovering more and more evidence of possible military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program. This chap here is the former Iranian ambassador to the IAEA. This was our former head of the Department of Safeguards. This is our current head of the Department of Safeguards, Max Aparo. So between 2013 and 2016, on a parallel track, there was the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the very political level, and on the IAEA side, a very practical technical roadmap for clarification of outstanding issues. The JCPOA was endorsed by the UN Security Council in July 2015 in Resolution 2231. And at the end of December that year, the IAEA was able to present a report on the status of outstanding issues, most of which still hadn't been resolved, but they at least checked that box. And implementation day started in January 2016. As I said, quite sadly, less than 2 years later, the US was withdrawn from the JCPOA, and we are where we are today, in large part because of that. As I mentioned, during this period of time, over a period of years, you see the negotiation of the Treaty on the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons. It actually finally entered into force in January 2021, and it has already had 2 meetings of the states' parties. So I'm not going to delve too much into that, but to say that this treaty also requires the implementation of safeguards under existing safeguards agreements, and if and when there is disarmament under irreversible disarmament of nuclear weapons programs. So what next? What happened in 2020? It opened with the coronavirus. It opened with hordes of locusts in Australia, hammerhead, cannibal worms, God knows what else, and the US Air Force showing videos of UFOs, and nobody cared. So very focused on the coronavirus. You have the postponement of the NPT. DPRK destroys the Joint Liaison Office, fell apart. You finally have the NPT RevCon postponed again until 22. You have the announcement of AUKUS, the US, Australia, United Kingdom collaborative work, that part of which involves nuclear-powered submarines. In the early part of 2022, you have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Finally, the convening of the NPT Review Conference, which sadly did not involve in the negotiation of agreed document. what we thought were going to be the most serious issues of Middle East Free Zone and Iran and the TPNW and DPRK actually took second seat, not only to AUKUS and nuclear naval propulsion, but ultimately the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. Russia withheld its consensus on the outcome document. So we're nearing the end of our travel through time, but I wanted to touch on my perspective of what some of the future challenges might be. Ukraine and Russia, what are the global implications of that? US-Russia-China relations, is there a new Cold War? Is it bilateral? Is it trilateral? What's happening in the disarmament field? What about emerging and hybrid technologies, AI, machine learning, what I generically refer to as the good, the bad, and the ugly, because each of these technologies has good, bad, and ugly possible applications. What about outer space? What are the prospects for arms control in outer space? But fundamentally, I worry about whether the NPT and nuclear arms control can survive if there's no movement in nuclear disarmament. So we've talked about today's regime, which is more or less a patchwork quilt of, as states' perceptions of where the threat came about, you found, I'm going to fix that with safeguards. I'll fix that with export controls. I'll fix that with nuclear weapon free zone treaties, development of nuclear security, counterproliferation. It's really a patchwork quilt. And the more tightly it can be woven, the more difficult it will be for a new nuclear power to develop out of this. But if this is today's regime, I ask you, what is tomorrow's regime going to be? Because it will be in your hands. So I'm going to stop sharing now. We've just finished our travel through time, and I'd love to entertain any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Laura. I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was really interesting. So I think we can get started with some questions. So please do feel free to share any questions, comments, thoughts that you may have. You can either use the raise your hand function, or if you just want to speak up, that's fine. And if you're unable to speak or you don't feel comfortable doing so, you can always add your contribution to the chat function, and I'm happy to read it out for you. So I'll open the floor to anyone who wants to speak before I jump in. I've got a few questions of my own as well.
I'm sure you must have questions. I know I presented an extensive presentation, but I nowhere near covered everything.
Okay. Oh, Declan, you've got your hand raised. I'll let you pop in.
Hi, thanks. It took me embarrassingly long to find the raise hand function just then. But thank you for a brilliant presentation, Laura. That was really interesting and had so much detail. I guess my question at the moment is about verification, because I've been thinking about it lately, and in particular when you're talking about the different levels of access that states, that the IAEA and verification, entities kind of do or don't have, is something that I've been finding really interesting lately. And I guess I was wondering, where do you see kind of the balance between the level of verification allowed, considering how restrictive states often are with what they allow to be seen within their nuclear and their military services, and how much is perhaps is enough to get enough trust? I think in particular when it comes to nuclear disarmament, as I see that often one of the biggest criticisms of the TPNW, for example, is a lack of verification regime. But what would a verification regime look like, and could it possibly be like the IAEA? Would states trust that low level of verification, if you like, to then trust states to fully do away with their nuclear arsenals, or would you need something potentially stricter but harder to sign?
Well, Declan, you have just asked about 10 questions. And it's a great 10 question. Let me start with, I think the agency and its member states have plugged a lot of the holes in the very early days of non-proliferation verification. And I think the conclusion of the model additional protocol and the support for the additional protocol is very strong. And I think member states understand, although right now everything's a little bit shaky, that the better the IAEA safeguard system is, the more likely it is to be effective, the more likely it's going to deter states from trying to cheat. So I think it's doing a good job. I think, unfortunately, there is little or no current taste for further strengthening safeguards. And I hope it doesn't take another Iraq to make that happen. But right now, states are distracted. But then you segue into states with military activities, the nuclear weapon states, let's call it. The access the agency has in those states is extremely limited, even in the US and the UK, which has offered much more of its the civilian nuclear fuel cycle than the other 3 NPT nuclear weapon states. And India and Pakistan, very, very limited safeguards in both of those countries, because, you know, they have the old item-specific agreements. So in terms of disarmament, I think we're going to have to start with something like IMCIRC 153 plus the additional protocol plus, because states are going to want, it's probably easier to ensure that a state hasn't acquired the first one than to make sure the state has gotten rid of everything, including its very last one. But one thing I need to underscore about verification, no matter the regime, no matter how extensive it is, the agency will never be able to declare 100% zero non-compliance, okay? Even as much authority as we had in Iraq under the Security Council resolution, there's no such thing in any verification regime of 100%. But you are right that that there's going to be a lot more access needed in order to provide assurances that the nuclear weapon states have in fact disarmed. Do I think there's a role for the agency? Yes, but I think the closer you get to the actual nuclear weapon itself, the more likely and perhaps the more desirable it will be to find an alternative mechanism to verify that part of the dismantlement process. The agency knows how to verify nuclear material. It's been doing it for years. It's very good at it. But I think if you're talking about the actual delivery systems or the warheads themselves, I think a different mechanism will have to be developed, because if you task the agency with doing that, I think it's going to change the very nature of the IAEA. You're going to be talking about highly proliferation sensitive information. So I think the TPNW, the reason they didn't include verification activities is nobody knows quite how to verify disarmament just yet. In the case of South Africa, we did the verification after the fact, which has its own pluses and minuses. Long-winded answer to your 10-question question, but thanks for that, Declan.
Okay, so we have a follow-up question to Declan's questions there's in the chat, and then we've got another couple of hands raised as well. So Dan has asked, how has the IAEA's ability to develop new verification tools and techniques on its own, e.g. robotics for spent fuel verification, evolved over time? And as well, have states become more flexible about allowing such innovation as the risks perceptions have changed?
The agency has, in fact, evolved the technical measures that it's used over the years. For example, in the very early days, when you had satellite imagery that was all national technical means, we were very careful about. In fact, North Korea, we were able to help convince the board about the need for a special inspection by showing them satellite images. And now we've evolved to the point where we do our own satellite imagery analysis. We have contracts with tens of countries around the globe and implement, there's actually a division in the Department of Safeguards that handles satellite imagery. Using machine learning for information, open source information. It's like a fire hose of information now. So they've had to try to develop machine learning tools that helps take some of the burden off the analysts and allows them to focus on the heavy duty stuff. That I know they're working on robotics. I know they're looking further into AI, and they're constantly looking at ways to make safeguards not just more effective, but more efficient. And they have a whole division in the Department of Safeguards that looks into technical measures. We've improved the kind of seals we use. They've improved the kind of surveillance equipment that is used, and nothing stops. Now, environmental sampling, it was a technique, a very powerful technique we learned how to use in Iraq and North Korea, and it's now become common use. So states are a little bit nervous when it's first introduced, a new technology, but as long as the Secretariat is able to make a good case for it and build in whatever guardrails need to be built in to protect proliferation sensitive information or commercially sensitive information. States are initially obviously very protective of their sovereignty and their national security, but working with member states, the agency is able to continue to develop these techniques. I think emerging tech has a lot of exciting applications going forward. On the other hand, as I said, good, bad, and ugly. You can use those things for diversion, but you can also use many of those techniques for verification. I also saw something about AUKUS in one of the chat. Nuclear material for naval propulsion. Do I have any take on safeguards of nuclear materials for space propulsion or space nuclear fission reactors for power production? So let's start with submarines. I think these problems can be solved. I think there are technical problems, and obviously there's a high degree of political sensitivity right now. But I think with a lot of imagination and a little of political goodwill, that issue can be solved. I do think that the agency is already having to start to think about small modular reactors that are difficult to access, space reactors that are used for power as opposed to anything else. Those are difficult to access reactors. They will continue to, if you'll forgive the expression, proliferate. And I think the agency is already struggling with those kinds of issues. Last year at the Safeguard Symposium, there was a panel that covered space, cargo transport, submarines, and other innovative applications of nuclear energy. And you might want to take a look at the IAEA's website and some of the papers that were presented on that panel.
Thank you very much, Laura. So we have a queue of hands raised. So I'll pass over to Saida first, and then we've got Sarah and Sana. So Saida, I'll let you go ahead with your question.
Thank you for such a comprehensive presentation, Laura, and taking us through the evolution of CSAs. I have two questions for you. I want to ask, what are your views on advancing civilian use of nuclear energy in Pakistan, and what safety and security issues might come in the way? And my second question is about your views on NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, and how can we advance the completeness and correctness of the purpose of cartel? And if NSG goes for entertaining non-NPT states applications for membership, what criteria should be set for that? Thank you.
Thank you. I tell you what, why don't we take a couple of people's questions, and then I'll try to answer those. I think Sarah was next.
Yeah. Hi, Laura. Thank you for an excellent overview presentation. And we did meet before, but maybe, yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot in case you don't remember me, but I've always valued your input. So my question is not unconnected from Dan's question. It is about new technologies. I do understand that the IAEA does count third-party sources as safeguards, as potentially safeguards relevant information. And I'm wondering, in view of your depiction of the evolution of safeguards, to what extent was the acceptance of third-party sources of information connected to the proliferation of commercial satellite imagery, but not just, also the proliferation of analysis activities in the NGO space, and to what extent did those technological developments impact intersect with the perceptions of member states of the state level concept and approach to safeguards verification? And more broadly, how did those developments reflect on the perception of the IAEA as a neutral agency?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take
Thank
one
you.
more person and then I'll go through those questions as best I can.
Thank you.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for your extensive presentation and nice to see you again.
You too, Sam.
I have a very broad question regarding Iran, given that it's in the news lately, and what to do about, situations where you have countries that have accumulated a lot of fissile material, that are at the threshold, but have not crossed the threshold yet. And given that there is no formal sort of prohibition on accumulating highly enriched uranium or weapons-grade plutonium, even though there may be no credible civilian use for it or commercial rationale for it, can there be any safeguards and verification mechanisms that can be enhanced or introduced, or maybe I don't know about introduced, to prevent a state that is at the threshold but from crossing the threshold, if that makes sense? Thank you.
That's another easy question. All right, I'm going to start with Saidas. What are my views on advancing civilian nuclear? I assume you mean nuclear energy in Pakistan. Probably have a lot of need for nuclear energy. So they certainly have the right to develop nuclear energy. It would be really important that their supplier makes sure that safeguards agreements are concluded with respect to any broadening of their civilian use of nuclear material. Also, I do think there's a role for non-energy peaceful nuclear uses in Pakistan. At the VCDMP, we actually hosted the Pakistani senior scientist responsible for cancer treatment for all of Pakistan. So I think there are lots of non-energy applications that would be useful, not just in Pakistan, but other countries. Obviously, the critical aspect of further development of Pakistan's civilian program is a safeguards agreement that goes along with every one of those supplies. I myself I'll be honest with you, I thought the United States made a big mistake in 2005 and subsequently in expanding the NSG to include India. I think it was done for security reasons that don't seem to have panned out. And certainly the US is probably the single party that hasn't received any commercial advantage from having strong-armed states into becoming parties to permitting India to enter the NSG. So I think on balance that I would have preferred that had not happened. I think it was a chink in the armor of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, but there we are. New techniques and third-party sources. Among the third-party sources that the agency uses are certainly open source information, which has become more and more acceptable. Even the use of intelligence information, but that has to be very, very carefully handled. And I know for a fact that it is carefully handled. That's not a major part of what the agency sees. Intel is probably, I've been told, not more than 10% of the data that the agency has and uses to analyze safeguards. There are obviously sensitivities about the use of intelligence information. No more worst case scenario than the use of fabricated forgeries in the case of Iraq in 2003 as a basis for invading Iraq. But as I said, what has to happen as the agency is developing these technologies is to bring the member states along with it to, first of all, to find out what the concerns of the member states are, to learn from them, and to address those concerns. How do they intersect with the state level concept? Not so very much. I mean, certainly those new technologies will be used in the course of evaluating the information for a state as a whole. The issue with the state level concept was really, I think it came about really 2011, and it was surprisingly the boogeyman of the Russians, who had no skin in that game, and they were causing difficulties in other contexts, far beyond safeguards. So it may well have had to do with the change in their presidency. But I think what the Secretary did learn from the SLC debate was that more frequent and better communication with the member states was really important. Member states get really mad when the agency gets out in front of it. But I don't think it had much to do with technical developments, but concerns about discrimination as opposed to differentiation. Let's see, how to reflect on perceptions. Consultation, consultation, consultation. Sana, on Iran, what can be done about countries on the threshold? There's certainly, you're right, there is no prohibition on the quantities of high enriched uranium that a state can acquire and store. I think that issue is probably going to continue to be a political issue rather than a safeguards issue for many years. And as I said, God help us, it doesn't take another nuclear weapon state non-nuclear weapon state becoming a nuclear weapon state before states get religion and start thinking of more imaginative and more effective ways of curbing the production of high enriched uranium that don't seem to have any other purpose besides a nuclear weapons program. Not very satisfactory answer, but I think that's a political answer for the time being. Right now, there's no taste, no political taste for strengthening safeguards among the member states that I can see that could get any traction right now, sadly.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Just check before I jump in with my question, if there's anyone else waiting to ask anything or share any comments. No? Okay, mine's quite a broad question, but it's on the implementation of safeguards and how specifically the IAEA reviews that process, and are those processes the same across the different types of safeguard agreements, or is there kind of different review processes tailored to each kind of specific one?
You know, that's a great question, because the answer is the process is fundamentally the same. And I wish I had shown you this wheel of activity. If any of you have ever seen presentations by the Department of Safeguards, it starts with information coming into the agency, including information from CSAs, from the additional protocols, whatever the safeguards agreement is, and it is evaluated. And depending on the type of safeguards agreement that exists, there is a certain analysis done. In the case of the comprehensive safeguards agreement states, they do what is called, God, now I'm not going to be able to come up with the name, diversion path, that's not the word for it. They do an analysis of how a state might be able to divert nuclear material should it decide to do so. It's not a judgment about intention. It's taking a deep dive look at a country, what it technically is capable of, what its legal structure looks like, and if they were to choose to divert, what could they do, and how do we focus safeguards on those acquisition path analysis? That's what it's called. How would we go about addressing those key points in the acquisition path instead of trying to do everything all the time? And then they develop a state level plan, a state level approach, which is a document, and then they implement it. And then they do an analysis of how well it is implemented. Are there any anomalies? Are there any unresolved issues? You go back to the state, you try to resolve them. And on the basis of all of those activities, the agency draws safeguards conclusions. This process goes on every single year for every single country in which safeguards are implemented. There is no such thing as closing the file. There's no such thing as a permanent gold star. At the end of every year, the Department of Safeguards goes through all the safeguards agreements, looks at what it has seen in the state, all the information available to it, what kinds of conclusions it's able to draw, and then publishes those conclusions for the June Board of Governors meeting, which just took place last week. Those conclusions are published in something called the Safeguards Implementation Report. And the first few pages of that are always made available, called the Safeguard Statement. But this whole idea of looking at the state as a whole applies to any country that has a safeguards agreement. It's just in those states, like the nuclear weapon states and India, Pakistan, and Israel, the objective of safeguards in those states are very, very different. Okay, so we're not looking for undeclared nuclear activities in the nuclear weapon states. We're not actually looking for undeclared nuclear activities in India, Pakistan, or Israel, because that's not the mandate in those countries. But it is still important to look at what the state has, what if they were going to, in the case of the nuclear weapon states or India, Israel, Pakistan, you call it a diversion path scenario. In the non-nuclear weapon states, you call it acquisition path analysis. It's the same idea. If a state wanted to do it, how would they go about it? And what kind of safeguards measures can be implemented to try to detect it if it happens and deter it from happening, because it will be detected. Fundamentally, the same approach, regardless of the safeguards agreement, but obviously the details are very different depending on the type of safeguards agreement.
Thank you very much. Yes, Sarah, do you have a final question?
I do. Okay, I'm really curious if there's any crosstalk between the IAEA and the safeguards community more broadly and arms control communities, to the extent that in arms control, even disarmament, the interest is in verifying the absence of nuclear weapons programs. And I'm wondering if arms control, disarmament resort to the wealth of knowledge that the safeguards community and the IAEA have amassed over the years and decades to learn about ways to verify the abolition of nuclear arsenals.
Very, very complex question. A lot of different things to talk about there. What I can tell you is institutionally, the agency has evolved from an institution where I happen to know personally didn't much care for or pay attention to the NGO community or civil society, to an organization that actively reaches out to these entities to try to find out what's going on out there, what's a new way of thinking about it. So it's been, I think, a really important change. When I was there, it was like, who cares? You know, that's the NGO, that's civil society, that's academia. But I think there's a growing perception that, particularly when you have limited resources in the IAEA, it's great to have people looking at new technologies and new ways of looking at things. Now, the crossover to the, if you will, the arms control negotiations, disarmament negotiation, that can be more sensitive, not really from the point of view of the Secretariat, but from the point of view of the member states, because some of them aren't sure they want the agency to move in that direction yet. Certainly the fissile material cutoff treaty it makes absolute sense to get the agency involved in that. Because basically what we're doing in the non-nuclear weapon states is a fissile material cutoff treaty. But there are a lot of political sensitivities about expanding the agency's authority. It's not a very satisfactory answer to your question, but I think the Secretariat is open to it. I think institutionally, the organization is more open to outsider analysis now. And I think that's a good development. But I think, and there certainly are applications within disarmament and arms control that the agency could well contribute to. Depends on political sensitivities.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laura. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to draw this session to a close. But I would like to say thank you very much for joining us today, Laura, and sharing your expertise on nuclear safeguards and safeguarding. I hope that this has been a really interesting and thought-provoking session for everyone watching today. And thank you to those of you who have joined us live today, and for your questions, your contributions as well, and also to those of you who may be joining us virtually and watching this recording. So I thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a nice day and hope you join us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for your questions. You guys have an interesting future in front of you. That's all I can say.
It's great. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.